Well, thank you, Gil, and good evening, everybody. We have to get started on the right foot. I just have a philosophy about this, and the way we're going to do that is each of you is going to turn to a person sitting close to you right now and say to them, "This had better be good." Would you do that right now? Turn to your neighbor. Now, don't you feel better having done that? I certainly do. In 1949, Emilio Franco regained his speaking voice. Mr. Franco was a coal miner from West Virginia, and he was rendered mute by a nervous system disorder. In the summer of that year, Mr. Franco and his family went to New York City and made their way out to Coney Island. And while there, he rode what was then the most terrifying roller coaster in America, the Cyclone. And it was on one of the steep descents of the Cyclone that Mr. Franco began screaming. And later, while he was disembarking from the car, he spoke the first words that he had spoken since World War II. And he said, "I feel sick." I feel sick. Who wouldn't say that after riding the Cyclone? But you know, these days, and these many years later, we can hardly open the morning newspaper or watch the evening news or turn to your favorite news website without having a Malox moment of your own. We live, it seems, in an age of great moral and spiritual deficits. And by any objective measure, the culture seems to be on life support, and the patient is not doing well. The individual, the family, the church, civil government, even decent and civil society today are all under assault. In short, we live in a defining time for people of faith. Do you feel that way? I'm guessing you're here at the Values Voter Summit because you see your faith as both deeply personal and practical, and rightly so. You believe that faith is not something relegated only to the realm of personal morality and ethics. I suspect that you recognize that having believed, we have an obligation to live out our faith in the wider world. We have to live out our faith before a watching and listening world. We're called to do this because God is sovereign over His creation and all of it. And the implications for that sovereignty are profound. His sovereignty over all of His creation means quite logically that God is sovereign over business and education and medicine and law and community service. He's sovereign over all of the institutions of culture, including, and maybe especially, government and politics. As a Christian, I might put it this way: we are commanded in response to that sovereignty to bring the gospel of Jesus Christ to the world. It's called by theologians the Great Commission of Christ. But we're also commanded to bring the mind of Christ to the culture. That's referred to by many as the cultural mandate. That it's our obligation as His representatives to represent Him in the culture, and that the Word of God becomes the mind of Christ to us, and we take that to the culture. These two commands, the Great Commission and the cultural mandate, together comprise the ethic of Christian cultural engagement. It's this engagement that brought the world out of the dark ages. It's this engagement, applying the mind of Christ and the Word of God to the world around them, that shaped Western civilization as we know it today. And it was the Protestant Reformation that put the Word of God into the hands of common people. And this quite naturally led to a birth of widely available education as people thirsted to read so they could apprehend the Word of God for themselves. And that That widely available education gave birth to freedoms never before realized on the face of the earth. Why? Because the Christian church took the gospel and the mind of Christ into the dark ages and brought about Western civilization. Did you know that? Have you ever thought about that? Chief among those freedoms, of course, you might take it even deeper than I was about to say. Chief among those freedoms is religious freedom. You might take that deeper and say freedom of conscience. All 5 of the pillars of the First Amendment to our Constitution rest upon the freedom of conscience. There is no religious freedom if there's not freedom of conscience. There is no free speech if your conscience is not free, nor a free press, nor a freedom of assembly. And you might as well whistle in the wind to petition your government for a right of redress of grievances when you have no freedom of conscience. My mentor and friend, Dr. D. James Kennedy, once said that religious freedom was unknown in the world until it was birthed in America. Some toleration in England of religion, yes, but freedom, no. And that's why even today we still talk 240 years later about the American experiment. So many of the things that gave birth and rise to the freedom of our nations were unknown in the world, and the world said, that'll never work. That'll never last. As former Yale professor William Lyons Phelps observed, our civilization is founded on the Bible. More of our ideas, our wisdom, our philosophy, our literature, our art, our ideals come from the Bible than all other books combined. Our civilization is founded on the Bible. And then there's this from Newsweek magazine, December 1982. When you hear that date, you know something's coming, right? For centuries, the Bible has exerted an unrivaled influence on American culture, politics, and social life. Now, historians are discovering that the Bible, perhaps even more than the Constitution, is our founding document. Newsweek magazine, 1982. But you know, we can't really look around at the world we see today without saying, my, how the mighty have fallen. Instead, we live in a world that is seemingly running headlong away from any notion of biblical morality. We live in a time when rabidly mendacious people can call historic Christianity hate speech, and a credulous or maybe complicit mainstream news media nods its head approvingly. This is why we sued the Southern Poverty Law Center. We sued the SPLC for the real harm that we have suffered for being named on their false and defamatory so-called hate map. But we have an even greater concern. The SPLC is merely a symptom. You don't have to wake up Einstein, as one of my college professors used to say, to see that the SPLC's real aim is to silence all dissent to their hard left agenda. Their fallacious definition of hate, or by their fallacious definition of hate, even Martin Luther King and Mother Teresa would be haters because of their devout faith in Jesus Christ and their belief in the sanctity of human life and God's plan for human sexuality. The SPLC's real aim is to drive every vestige of religious expression from the public square. Newhouse, Father Richard John Newhouse, called it the naked public square. And their plan for doing so is to marginalize and demonize people simply for subscribing to the historic Christian faith. And what are we to do about all of this? Well, we are not going to turn tail and run. Now is the time for us to gird our loins for battle. And I want you to watch this brief video right now.
When the gospel changes hearts and minds, then everything begins to change. And the same is true for Washington, D.C.
And for the many Christians that I bump into that say, God's written off Washington, D.C., I just laugh and say, you ought to come and see what God's doing on this hill.
The D. James Kennedy Center for Christian Leadership is training the next generation of leaders to stand for Christ.
Working on Capitol Hill, it can be a blur.
It's a dark place on the Hill.
It's been very disappointing how many well-meaning Christians have gotten themselves elected and gotten there ill-equipped to do the job they've sought to fulfill. We're determined to change that.
Republicans' last-ditch attempt to overhaul Obamacare appears to be dead.
June 26, 2015, gay marriage is now legal across the United States.
There ain't no power like the power of the people.
We have a good foundation for believing that people who are properly equipped to serve in public policy positions will do well. We just need to get them there and get them equipped before they go.
To be strong and courageous.
We have been planning the launch of the D. James Kennedy Center for Christian Leadership for almost 2 years. We have looked at the landscape of leadership training and the kind of leadership training that's done, and we think there's an opportunity for us to do something unique and very impactful in our hope for the culture and for the future of America. We believe that God's calling us to raise up another generation of leaders to go into the public policy arena and seek to attain the highest level of influence that they can attain and stand there for Christ. We are on the cusp of a critical time in the life of our nation, and if we don't do this, we'll regret not having done it. So here's a question for you. What would our political landscape look like if we had leaders with an unshakable Christian conviction, a well-grounded biblical worldview, and a mastery of the principles, purposes, and political philosophy of the United States Constitution? What if those leaders had carefully studied the application of that political philosophy to the great moral, ethical, economic, and cultural questions of the day? And what if those leaders were well schooled in the critically important skills of communication, debate, negotiation, and planning? And what if all that education and training and equipping took place before those leaders were elected to high office? What would you have? Some would say you would have 1776, the founding generation. Leaders birthed and reared a generation that produced statesmen that literally changed the face of the world. And where are such leaders today? By God's grace, we do have some, but they are far too few. And the differential attribute, I think, from the founding generation to what we see today is a quality that's unsurprisingly lacking in our midst. And in a word, it is preparation. It's preparation. In the past, many Christians have responded to the biblical imperative of cultural engagement, yet increasingly the public square has surrendered to the forces of secularism, with the influence of a biblical worldview in the public policy arena dramatically diminishing. Often those answering a call to public service for Christ have entered that very challenging environment without being properly prepared to do so. And at no surprise, is it? George Barna told us that 1 in 10 Americans have a biblical worldview, or 1 in 10 Christians, have a biblical worldview. So who are we sending to Congress and to the United States Senate into positions of influence and power? People without a well-rounded biblical worldview. The D. James Kennedy Center for Christian Leadership, an outreach of the Center for Christian Statesmanship, represents a new era of leadership training, at least for those who name the name of Christ. The center was birthed to address this deficit of preparation for biblical cultural engagement, especially for leadership and service in the public policy arena. The Center for Christian Leadership is a comprehensive, intensive leadership training program based right here in Washington, D.C., right here on Capitol Hill. With face-to-face instruction provided by a distinguished faculty of experts, the training focuses on the necessary skill set and the necessary knowledge base to succeed in public life. The skill set training seeks to expand competency in communications, in debate, in media messaging, in negotiation and planning. The knowledge base seeks to expand understanding and application of a biblical worldview, a political philosophy, all within a robust constitutional framework. The strategic application focuses on communication strategy, political strategy, and the strategy of marketplace messaging. The faculty experts includes those from the fields of theology, constitutional law, education, communications, media, organizational development, and political strategy. John Wesley said, "Give me 100 men who hate only sin and love Jesus Christ, and we will shake England for God." And they did. That spirit captures the essence of the Center for Christian Leadership in contrast to the much-needed emphasis on grassroots political mobilization. The center seeks to uniquely prepare select leaders who, by God's grace, will attain significant positions of influence and authority in government and the public policy arena. The specific goal of the center is very straightforward. We're going to train 300 leaders a year, every year, for the next 10 years. And where will these future leaders come from? How will we identify those who are ready, willing, and able, and have a sense of a calling of God in their lives, and recognize the need for this preparation? Well, this is an invitation-only training. If we're going to invest in 300 people a year, we're going to pick the 300 people that, based on our assessment, gives us confidence that they'll finish the training. It's a very intensive training program, and when they do, we'll get behind them and help them move by God's grace to a place of significant influence and authority. We're looking for a gifted but teachable cohort. We're looking for those willing to invest their time and, quite frankly, some significant resources and efforts to pursue a unique calling. Now, some will say, leadership training, really? Have you looked around at the world? Have you seen how bad it is? We've got to do something now, which is essentially what a young seminary student said to Dr. Billy Graham many years ago. He said, "Dr. Graham, the need is so great for gospel ministry. Am I wasting my time here in seminary when I should be out there ministering to people who are perishing apart from Christ?" And Dr. Graham sagely replied, "Young man, the time that a woodsman spends sharpening his axe is not wasted." Preparation is the key to statesmanship. Let me close with this. At the beginning of the last century, one of the towering intellectual figures in British public life was Gilbert Keith Chesterton. G.K. Chesterton, we call him. He was a journalist, a writer, a social critic, and a theologian. His books, many books, are still widely available today. Chesterton was kind of an intellectual tour de force. He had an opinion on everything, and as such, his comments on a wide range of subjects were often sought by his literary friends. On one occasion, he was asked, the classic question, right? What book would you like if you were to be cast adrift on a lonely Pacific island and were permitted to have only one book? And one of his friends, knowing him to be a religious man, said, I suppose you would choose the Bible. And Chesterton's eyes twinkled, and he said, "No, not this time." And another friend, knowing of his broad literary interest, said, "I'd wager you would choose a copy of Shakespeare." And Chesterton said, "You would lose that wager." And then they both said, "Well, what would you choose?" And Chesterton smiled broadly and said, "If I were stranded on a lonely Pacific island, the one book I would choose of all the books in the world would be one titled a manual on how to build a ship. Chesterton was a devout but practical man, and these are the qualities we need today. People committed, but people willing to do the hard, practical work of preparation. The end and aim of the D. James Kennedy Center for Christian Leadership is to equip a highly select group of leaders who recognize the need for biblical truth in government and are striving for the highest position of influence they can attain in the arena of government and public policy. These are men and women who recognize Christ's sovereignty over all of his creation, including government and politics. When their training is complete, these people, relying upon the grace of God, will grow where they are planted, seizing every opportunity to bring the mind of Christ to bear in their lives, their work, and their relationships. They commit to becoming lifelong learners, continuing to build on the foundation established in their lives, and they commit to doing all these things for the glory of God. And I have this to say to you: perhaps you will be one of them. To find out more, visit us in the exhibit hall or come to our breakout session, which is tomorrow afternoon at 3:15 in the Congressional Room. Thank you for listening. God bless you, and may God bless America.